For 30 years I swallowed those little blue pills every single night. 30 years of depending on something that was slowly stealing my life away. The doctors said I needed them. My family believed I couldn't sleep without them. I believed it too. Until the day I found a crumpled receipt in my late husband's jacket pocket that changed everything. What I discovered wasn't just about sleeping pills. It was about a lie so big, so carefully constructed, that it had shaped 3 decades of my existence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy and I'm 72 years old now. People look at me and see a typical grandmother, the kind who bakes cookies and keeps tissues in her purse and wears sensible shoes. They don't see the woman who lost 30 years of her life to a prescription bottle. They don't see the anger that still burns in my chest when I think about how easily I was manipulated, how willingly I surrendered my autonomy, because someone I trusted told me I was broken. Started when I was 42. My husband Gerald and I had been married for 18 years. We had 2 children, Michael who was 16 and Sarah who was 14. We lived in a modest house in Cedar Springs, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Gerald worked at the hardware store his father had owned, and I worked part-time at the local library. Our life was ordinary in the best possible way. We weren't rich, but we had enough. We weren't adventurous, but we were content. Or at least I thought we were. I remember the exact night it began. It was a Tuesday in March. I'd had trouble falling asleep for a few nights in a row, nothing serious, just the usual worries that sometimes kept my mind racing. Sarah had been struggling in math class. Michael was applying to colleges and we were worried about the cost. Gerald's father had recently been diagnosed with emphysema, and the prognosis wasn't good. Normal life stresses, the kind everyone deals with. But on that particular Tuesday, I mentioned to Gerald over dinner that I'd been having trouble sleeping. I said it casually, the way you'd mention a slight headache or that you'd seen a nice sweater at the department store. I wasn't asking for help. I was just making conversation. Gerald put down his fork and looked at me with concern. Real concern, the kind that made his eyebrows draw together and his mouth turn down at the corners. Dorothy, he said, that's not good. Insomnia can be serious. You need to see Dr. Patterson about this. I laughed it off. I told him it was just a few restless nights, nothing to worry about. But he wouldn't let it go. All through dinner, he kept bringing it back to my sleep problems. He asked how many hours I'd gotten the night before. He wanted to know if I'd been waking up in the middle of the night, or just having trouble falling asleep. He asked if I felt tired during the day, if I was having trouble concentrating. The more he asked, the more I started to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe this was more serious than I thought. By the end of dinner, I'd somehow agreed to make an appointment with Dr. Patterson. Dr. Patterson had been our family doctor for years. He'd delivered both of our children. He'd treated our colds and flu, set Michael's broken arm when he fell off his bike, given us our annual checkups. He was a fixture in Cedar Springs, a man everyone trusted. His office smelled like antiseptic and old magazines, and his nurse Mrs. Henderson always had peppermints in her pocket. I went to see him the following week. Gerald insisted on coming with me, which surprised me because he never came to my doctor's appointments. He said he was worried about me, that he wanted to make sure I explained everything properly to the doctor. I thought it was sweet at the time. I thought it showed how much he cared. In Dr. Patterson's office, I sat on the examination table with the paper crinkling beneath me while Gerald sat in the chair by the door. Dr. Patterson asked me about my sleep. I told him the same thing I told Gerald, that I'd had a few restless nights but nothing too concerning. But then Gerald spoke up. He said it had been going on for weeks, not just a few nights. He said I'd been tossing and turning so much that it was keeping him awake too. He said I'd been irritable and forgetful, that I'd snapped at the kids over small things, that I'd forgotten to pay the electric bill last month. I started to protest because none of that was quite true. I'd been tired, yes, but I hadn't been particularly irritable. I'd forgotten one bill one time because it had gotten buried under some other mail. But Dr. Patterson was nodding along with everything Gerald said, making notes on his pad. How long has this been going on? Dr. Patterson asked Gerald, not me. Gerald answered that he thought it had been building for months, maybe even a year. He said he'd been noticing changes in me, subtle things at first but getting worse. He made it sound like I was falling apart, like I was on the verge of some kind of breakdown. I sat there on that examination table feeling confused and somehow ashamed. Was I really that bad? Had I been so wrapped up in my own head that I hadn't noticed how much this was affecting me? Affecting our family? Gerald was my husband. Surely he wouldn't exaggerate about something like this. Dr. Patterson put down his pen and looked at me with a kind of paternal concern. Dorothy, he said, insomnia is nothing to take lightly. It can affect your physical health, your mental health, your relationships. The good news is that we have medications that can help. I'm going to prescribe you something that will help you get the rest you need. He wrote out a prescription for something called Somnitol. He said it was a sleeping medication, very effective, very safe. He said I should take 1 pill every night before bed. He said it would help me fall asleep and stay asleep through the night. He said after a few weeks of good rest, I'd feel like a new person. I asked if there were any side effects I should know about. He waved his hand dismissively. Nothing significant, he said. Maybe a little grogginess in the morning at first, but your body will adjust. The benefits far outweigh any minor inconvenience. I asked if this was something I'd need to take long term. He said we'd evaluate after a few months, see how I was doing, but that some people did need to stay on sleep medication for extended periods. There was no shame in that, he said. If you had diabetes, you'd take insulin. If you have insomnia, you take sleep medication. It's the same thing. That made sense to me. I was being responsible, taking care of my health. Gerald squeezed my shoulder as we left the office. I'm proud of you for getting help, he said. This is going to make everything better. I filled the prescription that same day at Miller's Pharmacy on Main Street. The pharmacist, Mr. Miller, gave me the same speech about taking it before bed, not operating heavy machinery, not drinking alcohol with it. Standard warnings. He handed me a white paper bag with a stapled receipt and a bottle of little blue pills inside. That night I took my first Somnitol. I swallowed it with a glass of water while Gerald watched. Within 30 minutes I felt a heaviness creeping over me. A warm, drowsy feeling that was actually quite pleasant. I climbed into bed and Gerald kissed my forehead. Sleep well, he said. And I did. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, completely. When I woke up the next morning I felt groggy and slow, like I was moving through honey. But Gerald said that would pass, that my body just needed to adjust. After a few days, the morning grogginess did get a little better. And I had to admit I was sleeping. Every night, without fail. I took my little blue pill and fell into that deep, heavy sleep. No more lying awake worrying about college tuition or math grades or Gerald's father's health. The pill took care of everything. But something else started happening, something I didn't recognize at the time as connected to the medication. I felt different during the day. Flatter somehow, like my emotions had been turned down a few notches. Things that would have made me laugh seemed only mildly amusing. Things that would have upset me seemed distant and unimportant. I moved through my days in a kind of pleasant fog. Gerald seemed happier though. He said I was calmer, easier to be around. He said the medication was clearly working. And because I trusted him, because I loved him, I believed him. The months turned into years. Every month I went back to Dr. Patterson for a refill. Every month he asked me how I was sleeping, and I told him I was sleeping fine. He never asked how I felt otherwise. He never asked if I wanted to try stopping the medication. It became routine, automatic. Pick up the prescription, take the pill, sleep through the night, repeat. Michael graduated high school and went off to college. Sarah followed 2 years later. The house felt empty without them. I thought maybe I'd feel sad about that, the way other mothers seem to when their children left home, but I just felt a vague sense of things changing without any particular emotion attached to it. Gerald said I was handling the empty nest well, that some women fell apart when their kids left, but I was strong. I kept working at the library, shelving books and helping patrons find what they needed. I was good at my job. I showed up on time, I was pleasant and helpful. I never caused any problems. But I wasn't really there either. I was going through the motions, playing the role of Dorothy the librarian without actually being present in my own life. My coworkers were kind to me in that polite, distant way people are to someone they consider a bit odd but harmless. I'd catch them sometimes exchanging looks when I'd lose my train of thought mid-sentence, or when I'd need to be told something twice because I hadn't really absorbed it the first time. I told myself everyone got more forgetful as they aged. I was in my 50s by then. This was normal. Gerald's father passed away when I was 53. I went to the funeral and I held Gerald's hand and I said the appropriate things to the appropriate people. But I didn't feel much of anything. I watched Gerald cry, watched him grieve, and I felt like I was watching a movie rather than participating in real life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wondered if there was something wrong with me. Why I couldn't seem to access the deeper emotions that everyone else seemed to have. A night I took my pill. I always took my pill. It was as automatic as brushing my teeth. Gerald made sure of it. If I was running late or distracted, he'd bring me the pill and a glass of water. Can't forget this, he'd say with a smile. We don't want you going back to those sleepless nights. And I agreed. I didn't want to go back to sleepless nights. I couldn't even really remember what they'd been like anymore. Those few nights of restlessness that had started this whole thing. But they must have been bad if I needed medication for them. Everyone said so. Dr. Patterson, Gerald, even the pharmacist who filled my prescription month after month for years. When I turned 60, Sarah threw me a birthday party. She'd moved back to Cedar Springs with her husband Tom and their baby girl Emma. Michael came down from Seattle where he worked as an engineer. There was cake and presents and everyone sang happy birthday. I smiled and thanked everyone and cut the cake into neat slices. But later that night, after everyone had gone home and Gerald was asleep, I sat in the kitchen with a piece of leftover cake and tried to remember what turning 60 felt like, what turning 50 had felt like, what turning 40 had felt like. And I realized I couldn't really remember any of it clearly. The last 20 years felt like one long blurry stretch of time where nothing particularly good or particularly bad had happened. Just time passing, days flowing into each other, marked only by the monthly trips to the pharmacy and the nightly ritual of the little blue pill. I took my Somnitol that night like always, but for the first time in years just before the heaviness took over, I had a thought that felt almost like an alarm bell going off somewhere deep in my mind. What if I tried not taking it? What would happen? But then the medication pulled me under and I forgot I'd even had that thought. The years continued. My hair went gray then white. My hands developed age spots. My knees started to ache. I became a grandmother. Then a grandmother twice over when Michael's wife Julie had a son. I went through the motions of being a doting grandmother, buying toys and sending birthday cards and babysitting when asked. But I felt disconnected from it all, like I was playing a role I'd seen other grandmothers play rather than actually experiencing it myself. Gerald retired from the hardware store when he turned 65. I retired from the library a year later. We were supposed to enjoy our retirement, maybe travel a little, take up hobbies, spend time with the grandchildren. But our days fell into a routine that felt more like waiting than living. Gerald watched a lot of television. I did crossword puzzles and tended a small garden in the backyard. We ate dinner together every night, the same rotation of meals we'd been making for years. We went to bed at 9 o'clock. I took my pill. I slept. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of other people's lives and feel a strange sense of disconnection. Sarah would tell me about Emma's school play, and how she'd cried tears of joy watching her daughter on stage. Michael would call and tell me about hiking trips he'd taken, the way the mountain views had taken his breath away. I'd listen and nod and make the appropriate responses, but inside I'd wonder what tears of joy felt like, what having your breath taken away felt like. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anything that intensely. I thought this was just aging. I thought this was what happened when you got older, that life became smaller and quieter and less vivid. Everyone talked about the golden years of retirement, but nobody mentioned that the gold would be so faded, so tarnished. Then Gerald got sick. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away. Then shortness of breath. Then finally a diagnosis of lung cancer. Advanced, aggressive, inoperable. The doctor gave him 6 months to a year. I should have been devastated. This was my husband of 48 years. The father of my children. The man I'd built a life with. But when Dr. Patterson, the same Dr. Patterson who'd been prescribing my Somnitol all these years, told us the diagnosis, I felt that same flat, distant response I'd felt to everything else for the past 30 years. Gerald cried. He was scared. He didn't want to die. And I sat there next to him holding his hand and feeling like a terrible person, because I couldn't seem to access the emotions that should have been flooding through me. I thought maybe I was in shock. I thought maybe the emotions would come later. They never did. Not the way they should have. Gerald deteriorated quickly. faster than the doctors had predicted. Within 3 months he was bedridden. Hospice came in to help manage his pain. Sarah and Michael took turns visiting, spending time with their father while he could still communicate. I was there every day, of course. I brought him water and adjusted his pillows and sat by his bedside. But I felt like I was performing the duties of a wife rather than actually being one. One afternoon, about a week before Gerald died, he was having a good day. The pain medication had him comfortable and his mind was clear. Sarah and Michael had both left for the day to tend to their own families. It was just the two of us in the bedroom we'd shared for nearly 50 years. Gerald looked at me with those eyes that had once been bright blue but had faded to a watery gray. "Dorothy," he said, his voice weak and raspy, "I need to tell you something." I pulled my chair closer to the bed. "What is it?" I asked. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength or courage or both. "I've been a coward," he said. "I've been a selfish, cowardly man and you deserved better." I didn't know what he meant. I told him not to tire himself out, that he should rest. But he shook his head with as much vigor as he could muster. "No," he said. "I need to say this. I need you to know before I go. I can't take this to the grave. It's been eating at me." A small flutter of something, maybe anxiety or maybe curiosity, stirred in my chest. It was so unusual to feel anything distinctly that it almost startled me. "What do you need to tell me?" I asked. But then the hospice nurse came in to check his vitals and adjust his medication. By the time she left, Gerald had drifted off to sleep. I sat there for a long time watching him breathe, wondering what he'd been about to say. But eventually I went downstairs to make dinner that I didn't have much appetite for. I took my Somnitol that night like always. Gerald was in the hospital bed that had been set up in our bedroom. I was sleeping in the guest room so I wouldn't disturb him. I swallowed the little blue pill and felt it pull me down into that familiar darkness. Gerald died 4 days later. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. Sarah and Michael were there too. The hospice nurse was there. We all watched him slip away, and my children cried, and I felt that same terrible flatness, that same distance from what should have been the most profound moment of grief in my life. The funeral was well attended. Gerald had lived in Cedar Springs his whole life and people knew him. They came up to me and offered condolences and I thanked them and accepted casseroles and I played the part of the grieving widow. But inside I felt hollow. Sarah was worried about me. She stayed with me for 2 weeks after the funeral, sleeping in her old room, making sure I was eating, helping me sort through Gerald's things. She kept saying it was okay to cry, that I didn't have to be strong all the time. She said grief came in waves and there was no right way to mourn. But I wasn't being strong. I just wasn't feeling what I should have been feeling. And I didn't know how to explain that to her without sounding like a monster. After Sarah went back to her own house, I was alone for the first time in my adult life. The house felt enormous and empty. I wandered from room to room, looking at things that should have meant something, photographs and furniture and little keepsakes from 50 years of marriage. But they were just objects. They didn't stir anything in me. I kept up my routines. I made my meals and tended my garden and did my crossword puzzles. I took my Somnitol every night. I slept alone in the big bed that Gerald and I had shared, the bed where both of my children had been conceived, the bed where Gerald had died. And I felt nothing except that persistent, nagging flatness. About 3 weeks after Gerald's death, I was going through his clothes to donate them to the church thrift shop. Sarah had offered to help, but I told her I could do it myself. I was pulling suits and shirts and pants from the closet, folding them into boxes, when I found his brown jacket, the one he'd worn for years to run errands or work in the garage. I pulled it off the hanger and something crinkled in the pocket. I reached in and pulled out a crumpled receipt. It was old, faded, the ink barely legible. It was from Miller's Pharmacy. I almost threw it away, but something made me smooth it out and look at it more closely. The date on the receipt was from 30 years ago. March, the same month I'd started taking Somnitol. But this receipt wasn't for my prescription. It was for Gerald's. And the medication listed wasn't Somnitol. It was something called Placitol. I stared at that receipt for a long time, not understanding what I was seeing. Why would Gerald have been picking up a prescription the same month I started mine? I didn't remember him being on any medication back then. And what was Placitol? I'd never heard of it. I sat down on the bed with the receipt in my hand. My heart was beating faster, which was strange because I couldn't remember the last time my heart had beat fast from anything other than physical exertion. Something about this receipt felt important, though I couldn't figure out what. I went downstairs to the kitchen and opened the drawer where we kept old papers and receipts and random documentation. I hadn't looked through it in years. I started pulling things out, creating piles on the kitchen table. And that's when I started finding more receipts from Miller's Pharmacy. Dozens of them over the years, all made out to Gerald, all for Placitol. My hands were shaking now. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Gerald had been picking up a medication called Placitol for years, maybe decades, and I'd never known about it. Why would he hide a prescription from me? Why would Mr. Miller have filled it without question all those years? I needed answers. I needed to understand what this meant. I looked at the clock. It was 3 in the afternoon. Miller's Pharmacy would still be open. I grabbed my purse and my car keys. I hadn't driven much since Gerald got sick. Hadn't really gone anywhere except the grocery store. But I got in the car and drove the familiar route into town, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. Miller's Pharmacy looked the same as it always had. The same green awning and the same neon sign in the window. But Mr. Miller had retired years ago. His son David Miller ran the place now. I'd known David since he was a boy. He'd gone to school with Michael. I walked in and the bell above the door chimed. David looked up from the counter and smiled. "Mrs. Patterson," he said. "I was sorry to hear about Gerald. How are you holding up?" I walked up to the counter and pulled out the handful of receipts I'd found. I spread them on the counter between us. "David," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, almost sharp, almost urgent. "I need you to tell me what Placitol is." David looked down at the receipts and then back up at me. His smile faded. He looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Patterson," he said slowly, "I don't think I should discuss another patient's medications. Gerald was my husband," I said. "He's dead now. And I need to know what this medication was for. Please." David shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked around the empty pharmacy as if hoping someone would come in and interrupt this conversation. When no one did, he sighed. "Placitol isn't a real medication," he said quietly. I felt like the floor had tilted beneath me. "What do you mean it's not real?" I asked. "It's a placebo," David said. "Sugar pills. They're used sometimes in clinical studies, or when a doctor thinks a patient needs to believe they're taking medication, but doesn't actually need the medication itself." His father filled these prescriptions for years based on an arrangement with Dr. Patterson. The world seemed to stop. I stood there in Miller's Pharmacy staring at David, trying to process what he'd just told me. Sugar pills. Gerald had been picking up sugar pills for 30 years. But why? What arrangement with Dr. Patterson? "I don't understand," I whispered. "Why would Gerald need sugar pills?" David looked miserable. He clearly didn't want to be having this conversation. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, "I think you should talk to Dr. Patterson about this. I really shouldn't say more." But I couldn't talk to Dr. Patterson. Dr. Patterson had retired 5 years ago and moved to Florida. I'd gotten a postcard from him once, a generic retirement greeting. He was gone. "David," I said, and I heard the pleading in my own voice. "Please. Gerald is dead. Whatever arrangement they had, it doesn't matter anymore. I need to understand what happened." David closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked sad. When his father retired and left me the pharmacy, he told me about a few special arrangements he'd had with Dr. Patterson. The Placitol prescriptions for your husband were one of them. Gerald paid for them out of pocket so they wouldn't show up on insurance. They were marked as a different medication in the system to maintain privacy. "Why?" I asked. "Why did my husband need fake medication?" "He said he was worried about you," David said quietly. "He told my father that you needed to believe he was taking something to help him cope with your condition. He said it would give you peace of mind." "My condition?" I repeated. "You mean my insomnia?" David's expression grew even more uncomfortable. He shifted his weight again. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson. That's all I know. You'd have to ask him for more details, but since he's gone, I thought about Gerald lying in that bed, telling me he'd been a coward, saying he needed to confess something before he died. The confession he never got to make because he ran out of time." I gathered up the receipts with shaking hands. "Thank you, David," I said. My voice sounded far away. "Mrs. Patterson," David called as I headed for the door. if there's anything I can do. But I was already leaving, stepping out into the afternoon sunlight that seemed too bright, too harsh. I got in my car and sat there in the parking lot trying to breathe, trying to think. Gerald had been picking up fake medication for 30 years. Medication that was somehow connected to my condition, to my insomnia. But why? What did sugar pills for him have to do with sleeping pills for me? Unless they weren't just for him. Unless the arrangement with Dr. Patterson was more complicated than David knew or was willing to say. I drove home in a daze. When I got there, I went straight upstairs to the bathroom. I opened the medicine cabinet and pulled out my current bottle of Somnitol. Little blue pills just like always. I'd taken one every single night for 30 years. I looked at the label. Prescribed by Dr. Patterson. Filled at Miller's Pharmacy. Directions. Take 1 tablet by mouth at bedtime. I opened the bottle and poured a few pills into my palm. They looked like pills. They looked like medication. But now I was wondering, now I was questioning everything. I went back downstairs to the kitchen and got online on the old laptop Michael had set up for me years ago. I typed in Somnitol, expecting to find information about sleeping medication, side effects, warnings, all the things you'd find for any prescription drug. But there was nothing. No medication called Somnitol. No drug company manufacturing it. No FDA approvals. Nothing. I tried different spellings. I tried searching for sleeping medications in general. I spent hours clicking through websites, reading about actual sleeping pills, their chemical compositions, their effects. Somnitol didn't exist. It wasn't real. It had never been real. I sat back in my chair feeling like I couldn't breathe. For 30 years I'd been taking pills I believed were medication. Pills my doctor had prescribed. Pills my pharmacist had filled. Pills my husband had made sure I took every single night. But they weren't medication. They were something else. And everyone who should have protected me had been in on whatever this was. My mind was racing now, really racing for the first time in decades. If the pills weren't real sleeping medication, what were they? Why would Dr. Patterson prescribe fake pills? Why would Gerald make such a point of ensuring I took them every night? Why would the pharmacy fill a prescription for a medication that didn't exist? And most importantly, why had I felt so flat, so emotionally distant, so disconnected from my own life for 30 years if the pills I was taking were just placebos? Unless they weren't placebos. Unless they were something else entirely, something that had been slowly stealing who I was. I looked at the pills still sitting in my palm. Little blue pills that I trusted completely. Pills I'd swallowed without question year after year. Because I believed I needed them. Because Gerald said I needed them. Because Dr. Patterson said I needed them. I was 72 years old. I'd spent 30 years of my life, more than a third of it, taking medication that apparently didn't exist. 3 decades of my life had passed in a fog while everyone around me assured me I was fine. I was better, I was sleeping well. But at what cost? What had I lost while I slept through those nights? What parts of myself had I surrendered to those little blue pills? I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand what had been done to me and why. But Gerald was dead and Dr. Patterson was gone, and I was sitting alone in my kitchen holding pills I no longer trusted, looking at a life I barely recognized as my own. The sun was setting outside. Soon it would be time for bed. Time to take my pill just like I'd done every night for 30 years. But tonight, for the first time since that Tuesday in March 3 decades ago, I wasn't going to take it. Tonight I was going to see what happened when I didn't swallow that little blue pill. Tonight I was going to start looking for answers. I poured the pills from my hand back into the bottle. Then I walked to the kitchen sink and with shaking hands, I opened the bottle and poured all of them down the drain. I watched them circle the drain and disappear. 30 years of my life washing away with them. And then I started looking for the truth. That first night without the pill was unlike anything I'd experienced in 3 decades. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. But this time it felt different. My mind wasn't racing with worry like it had all those years ago. Instead it was sharp, alert, processing everything I'd discovered. The quiet of the house seemed louder somehow. Every creak and settle of the old foundation more pronounced. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, something I hadn't noticed in years. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees outside my window. I was present in a way I couldn't remember being present before. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and went back downstairs to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the table with Gerald's old filing cabinet keys. He'd kept a locked cabinet in his den, the small room off the living room where he'd spent so much time on his laptop over the years. I'd never questioned what he kept in there. It was his private space, his business records from the hardware store, documents and papers that didn't concern me. Or so I'd believed. The den felt strange at night, shadowy and unfamiliar. I turned on the desk lamp and it cast a warm circle of light over Gerald's old wooden desk. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Sarah and Michael had asked if I wanted help clearing it out, but I'd told them I'd do it when I was ready. Now I realized I'd been avoiding it. Some part of me knowing that I wasn't ready to face whatever might be hidden here. The filing cabinet was tall and gray with 4 drawers. I tried the first key and it didn't fit. The second one slid in smoothly and turned with a click that sounded too loud in the quiet house. I pulled open the top drawer and found what I expected. Old tax returns, receipts from the hardware store, business correspondence. Nothing unusual. The second drawer was more of the same. Insurance policies, warranties for appliances we'd bought over the years, the deed to the house. Normal things that any household would accumulate over decades of living. But the third drawer was locked separately with a different mechanism. None of the keys I had seemed to fit it. I tried every single one on Gerald's keyring, growing increasingly frustrated. This drawer had a secret, and I needed to know what it was. I ended up having to break the lock. I found a screwdriver in the kitchen drawer, and jimmied it until the mechanism gave way with a sharp crack. My hands were trembling as I pulled the drawer open, half afraid of what I might find, half desperate to know the truth. Inside were folders, dozens of them organized by year. I pulled out the one marked with the current year and opened it. Inside were medical records. My medical records. Copies of prescriptions. Notes from Dr. Patterson. But as I read through them, nothing made sense. The notes described a patient who was delusional, paranoid, suffering from severe mental instability. They described episodes I had no memory of, behaviors I'd never exhibited. According to these records, I'd had violent outbursts. I'd threatened Gerald. I'd been a danger to myself and others. The notes justified the Somnitol prescription as necessary to keep me sedated, to keep me manageable, to protect the family from my instability. But none of it was true. I'd never had violent outbursts. I'd never threatened anyone. I'd been tired and distant and emotionally flat. Yes, but never dangerous. Never unstable in the way these records described. I sat there on the floor of Gerald's den with papers spread around me, and the horrible truth began to crystallize. These weren't real medical records. They were fabricated, created to justify drugging me for 30 years. Dr. Patterson hadn't been treating me. He'd been helping Gerald keep me controlled. But why? Why would Gerald want to drug me into compliance? Why would Dr. Patterson go along with it? What possible reason could justify 3 decades of this deception? I kept digging through the drawer, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. There were bank statements, but not from our regular bank. These were from an account I'd never known existed, in Gerald's name only. The balances were substantial, far more money than we should have had from his salary at the hardware store and my part-time library work. There were investment statements showing stock purchases and dividend payments. There were property records for a small apartment in the next town over, a place I'd never heard of, in Gerald's name alone. There were receipts for expensive purchases, jewelry and clothing and dinners at restaurants, none of which had been for me. And then I found the photographs. They were tucked in a manila envelope at the back of the drawer. And when I pulled them out, my world shifted completely. They were pictures of Gerald with a woman I didn't recognize. A woman with dark hair and a bright smile, younger than me, beautiful. They were in restaurants together, on a beach somewhere warm and sunny, standing in front of what looked like the apartment building from the property records. In some photos they were kissing. In others they were simply standing close, comfortable with each other in a way that spoke of intimacy and time. The dates on the backs of the photos went back 25 years. 25 years. Gerald had been living a double life for a quarter century, and I'd been too drugged to notice. I spread the photos on the floor in chronological order, watching this other life unfold. Gerald and this woman year after year, aging together in these stolen moments while I sat at home in my fog taking my pills and going through my empty routines. There were photos of them at Christmas, at birthdays, on vacations to places Gerald had told me he was going for hardware conventions or to visit old friends. My hands found another envelope, this one containing letters. Love letters from this woman to Gerald, addressed to a P.O. box I'd never known about. The letters called him darling and sweetheart. They talked about their plans for the future, about when they could finally be together openly. They talked about how hard it was to share him, to always come second. But in the later letters the tone changed. The woman, whose name was Vivian according to her signature, wrote about being tired of waiting. She wrote about wanting him to leave me, to choose her, to stop making excuses. She wrote that she understood his situation was complicated, but surely after all these years there must be a way. Gerald's replies were in another envelope. He wrote about how difficult I was, how unstable, how he couldn't just leave me because I needed him. He wrote about his obligation to me, to our children, to the life we'd built. He wrote that Vivian needed to be patient, that eventually things would work out, but the timing had to be right. He'd painted me as a burden, as someone too fragile and unstable to function without him. He'd used my supposed mental illness as an excuse to keep both women in his life, the wife at home and the mistress in the apartment across town. And the pills had kept me compliant and unaware, too emotionally flat to notice what was happening right in front of me. I felt something rising in my chest, something hot and powerful that I hadn't felt in so long. I almost didn't recognize it. Rage. Pure burning rage. For 30 years Gerald had stolen my life. He'd convinced me I was sick when I wasn't. He drugged me into a stupor so I wouldn't notice his affair, his secret apartment, his hidden money. He'd enlisted Dr. Patterson in this scheme, created false medical records to justify it, made sure everyone believed I needed the medication to function. And I believed it too. I trusted him completely. I'd loved him. I'd taken care of him when he was dying, had held his hand, had performed the duties of a devoted wife while he'd been keeping this massive lie alive right up until his last breath. The confession he'd tried to make in those final days, it must have been this. He'd wanted to unburden himself before he died, to finally tell me the truth. But he'd run out of time, or perhaps his courage had failed him. Either way, he'd left me to discover it all on my own, left me to piece together the betrayal after he was safely dead and beyond consequences. I gathered all the papers, all the photos, all the letters, and carried them into the kitchen. I spread them across the table under the bright overhead light. Evidence of a life lived in shadows, of choices made to benefit Gerald at my expense, of a conspiracy to keep me docile and unaware. The sky was starting to lighten outside the kitchen window. I'd been awake all night, and instead of feeling tired, I felt more awake than I had in decades. My mind was clear, sharp, focused. Without the pill, without whatever had really been in those little blue tablets, I was starting to come back to myself. I made coffee, strong and black, and sat down to read through everything methodically. I needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to me. I needed to know exactly how deep this deception went. The bank statements showed regular deposits from the hardware store. Yes, but also large cash deposits that had no clear source. The investments had grown substantially over the years. Gerald had accumulated wealth I'd known nothing about, wealth that should have been ours together but that he'd hidden away in his name only. The property records showed he'd bought the apartment 15 years ago, paid it off 10 years ago. It was worth a considerable amount now according to the most recent assessment I found. Vivian had been living there all this time rent-free, supported by the man who was supposed to be my husband. I found more letters, earlier ones from before the apartment purchase. In these, Vivian wrote about her small rented place, about struggling to make ends meet on her teacher's salary. She wrote about how grateful she was for Gerald's help, for the money he gave her, for his support. She wrote that she knew it was hard for him to give her money when he had a family to support, but she appreciated it so much. So Gerald had been supporting 2 households for decades. The hardware store couldn't have paid enough for that. Where had the money come from? I found the answer in a folder marked simply contracts. Inside were documents related to my father's estate. My father had died when I was 35, 7 years before I started taking the Somnitol. He'd left me a substantial inheritance, the proceeds from selling his pharmacy business and his property. It had been enough that Gerald and I had talked about what to do with it. I remembered that conversation, remembered suggesting we invest it for retirement, for the kids' college funds. Gerald had agreed. He'd said he'd take care of setting up the investments, that I didn't need to worry about the details. He'd handle everything. And he had. He'd handled it by putting everything in accounts in his name only. He'd taken my inheritance, the money my father had worked his entire life to build, and he'd used it to fund his secret life with Vivian. The apartment, the vacations, the expensive dinners, all of it had been paid for with my money. The timeline made horrible sense now. My father had died, left me a substantial inheritance, and a year later Gerald had suddenly decided I had insomnia that required medication. Medication that kept me foggy and compliant, that kept me from asking too many questions about our finances, that kept me from noticing when money that should have been ours disappeared into accounts I couldn't access. He'd stolen from me. He'd drugged me to facilitate the theft. He'd created an entire false narrative about my mental health to justify it. And he'd lived a double life for 25 years while I'd existed in a medicated haze, playing the role of dutiful wife and mother without ever realizing I was being systematically robbed and betrayed. I thought about all the times I'd felt like something was wrong with me, like I was broken somehow because I couldn't feel things deeply anymore. I'd blamed myself. I'd thought I was defective, emotionally stunted, unable to access normal human feelings. But it hadn't been me. It had been whatever was in those pills, dulling my emotions, flattening my responses, keeping me passive and controllable. I thought about Sarah and Michael, my children who'd grown up watching their mother drift through life like a ghost. They probably thought it was just my personality, the way I was. They'd never known the woman I'd been before. The woman who'd laughed freely and cried when she was sad and felt the full spectrum of human emotion. That woman had been stolen from them too, replaced with a drugged shadow who went through the motions of motherhood without really being present. And Gerald had watched it all happen. He'd been there every single night, handing me that pill, making sure I took it, ensuring that I remained under control. He'd seen what it did to me and he hadn't cared because it served his purposes. It gave him the freedom to live his secret life while keeping his respectable facade as a family man in Cedar Springs. The rage I felt was consuming now, a physical sensation that made my hands shake and my jaw clench. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw things. I wanted to confront Gerald, to make him face what he'd done, to force him to answer for 30 years of systematic abuse. But Gerald was dead. He'd escaped accountability. He'd died with everyone thinking he was a good man, a devoted husband, a respected member of the community. His funeral had been full of people praising him, sharing fond memories, telling me how lucky I'd been to have him. I'd stood there in my flat, medicated state and accepted their condolences, never knowing that the man in the coffin had been the architect of my stolen life. He died believing he'd gotten away with it. And he had, hadn't he? He'd lived exactly as he wanted for decades, had his cake and ate it too, and had faced no consequences whatsoever. Except he'd left evidence. Whether through carelessness or some vestige of guilt, he'd kept all of this documentation locked away in his den. And now I had it. Now I knew the truth. And I wasn't going to let him keep his good reputation while I suffered in silence. But I needed to be smart about this. I needed to think clearly, to plan carefully. I couldn't just start showing these documents to people without understanding the full implications. I needed to know what laws had been broken, what recourse I had, whether I could recover any of the money Gerald had stolen from me. I needed a lawyer. But not just any lawyer. I needed someone who specialized in elder abuse, in financial crimes, in medical malpractice. I needed someone who would believe me and fight for me, and help me navigate the legal system. I also needed to know what had actually been in those pills. If they weren't Somnitol, if that medication didn't exist, then what had I been taking for 30 years? What substance had been powerful enough to suppress my emotions and keep me in that fog for so long? I thought about David at the pharmacy. He'd seemed uncomfortable when I'd asked about the Placitol, had mentioned an arrangement between his father and Dr. Patterson. He might know more than he'd told me, and if he didn't, he might be able to help me figure out what the pills actually were. But first I needed to sleep. Not drug-induced unconsciousness, but real sleep. My body was exhausted, my mind spinning with too much information, too many revelations. I went upstairs and lay down on the bed in the bright morning light and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept churning through everything I'd learned, every detail of Gerald's betrayal, every implication of what this meant for my future. But eventually, after what felt like hours, I drifted off into a light, fitful sleep. When I woke, it was early afternoon. My body felt heavy and strange, but my mind was clear. Clearer than it had been in 30 years. I got up and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My eyes looked different, more focused, more alive. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel strong rather than the shapeless, comfortable things I'd been living in. I put on makeup for the first time in months, not much, just enough to make me look pulled together. I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked determined. She looked angry. She looked ready to fight. Called Sarah first. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Mom," she said, "how are you doing? I've been worried about you." "I need your help," I said, my voice steady. "Can you come over? There's something important I need to show you." There must have been something in my tone because Sarah's voice immediately shifted to concern. "Of course," she said. "Is everything okay? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling better than I have in a very long time," I said. "Can you bring Michael too? I need to talk to both of you." Sarah agreed to call her brother, and they'd be over within the hour. After I hung up, I went back to the kitchen and organized all the documents I'd found. I separated them into categories: financial records, medical records, correspondence, photographs. I wanted everything laid out clearly so my children could see the full picture. While I waited, I made more coffee and forced myself to eat something. My appetite had been poor for so long that I'd grown used to barely eating, but now I realized I was actually hungry. Really hungry, with my stomach growling and my body demanding fuel. Another sign that my system was waking up from its long drugged sleep. Sarah and Michael arrived together, both looking worried. "Mom," Michael said as soon as he walked in, "what's going on?" Sarah said, "You sounded strange on the phone." I led them both to the kitchen and gestured to the documents spread across the table. "Sit down," I said. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. It's difficult for me to say. But you both need to know the truth about your father, about our marriage, about the last 30 years of my life." They sat, exchanging confused glances. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told them everything. About the sleeping pills that weren't real medication. About the fake medical records that painted me as dangerously unstable. About Gerald's affair with Vivian that had lasted 25 years. About the secret apartment and the hidden bank accounts. About my father's inheritance that Gerald had stolen and used to fund his double life. I showed them the documents as I spoke, passing the papers across the table so they could see for themselves. I watched their faces as they read, saw the confusion turn to shock, turn to horror, turn to anger. Sarah was crying by the time I finished. Michael's face had gone pale. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Michael said, his voice rough with emotion, "Dad did this? Our father did this to you?" I nodded. "For 30 years, I said. He drugged me to keep me compliant so I wouldn't discover his affair or question where the money was going. He enlisted Dr. Patterson to help him, created false medical records to justify it. I've been living in a fog for 3 decades because your father wanted the freedom to live 2 lives at once." Sarah was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "But you always seemed fine," she said. "You never seemed drugged or out of it. You were just quiet, just calm. We thought that was your personality." "That's what the drugs did," I said. "They didn't make me incoherent or obviously impaired. They just flattened everything, took away my ability to feel things strongly. I went through the motions of life without actually living it. I was there but not really present, functioning but not truly awake." Michael picked up one of the photos of Gerald and Vivian, studying it with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "All those business trips," he said quietly. "All those conventions and conferences. He was with her." "Yes," I said. "And I was at home taking my pill every night, never questioning, never suspecting, because the medication made me too passive to notice what was right in front of me." Sarah suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need to call him," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "I need to call Dad and tell him exactly what I think of him." "He's dead, Sarah," Michael said gently. "He can't answer for this." "Then we tell everyone else," Sarah said, her hands clenched into fists. "We tell everyone in this town what kind of man he really was. We make sure people know the truth." I stood up too, placing my hand on Sarah's arm. "That's exactly what we're going to do," I said. "But we're going to do it the right way. We're going to get lawyers involved. We're going to pursue criminal charges if possible against Dr. Patterson, even if he's in Florida. We're going to track down Vivian and we're going to recover every penny of my inheritance that your father stole. And yes, we're going to make sure people know the truth. But we're going to do it strategically, carefully, so that we get justice and not just revenge. Michael nodded slowly. What do you need from us, Mom? How can we help? I need you both to come with me to the pharmacy tomorrow, I said. I need to talk to David Miller again and find out what he knows about what was actually in those pills. Then I need help finding a lawyer who specializes in this kind of case. And I need you both to be prepared for this to get ugly. When people find out the truth about your father, it's going to change how they remember him. It's going to change our family's reputation in this town. I don't care about that, Sarah said fiercely. I care about you. I care about what was done to you. Dad deserves to have his reputation destroyed. He deserves worse than that. Michael was still looking at the documents, his expression dark. The money, he said. Can you get it back? I don't know, I admitted. That's something the lawyer will have to figure out. But I'm going to try. That was my father's legacy, money he meant for me to have, for us to use for our family's future. Gerald stole it and I want it back. We stayed up late into the night, the three of us, going through every document, piecing together the timeline of Gerald's betrayal. My children were devastated, struggling to reconcile the father they thought they knew with the man these papers revealed. But they were also angry on my behalf, ready to fight for me in a way I hadn't been able to fight for myself. That night, for the second night in a row, I went to bed without taking a pill. It was easier this time, knowing I had allies, knowing I wasn't facing this alone. I still didn't sleep well, my mind too active, my emotions too raw. But when I did sleep, I had dreams. Real dreams, vivid and strange and sometimes frightening, but real. I hadn't dreamed in 30 years. The pills had taken even that from me. The next morning, Sarah and Michael came back to the house early. We drove together to Miller's Pharmacy, a united front. David looked nervous when he saw all three of us walk in, like he knew this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. David, I said, my voice firm but not unkind, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. What was in the pills I was taking for 30 years? David glanced at my children, then back at me. Mrs. Patterson, I really don't think I should say anything more without talking to a lawyer. Too late for that, Michael said. His voice harder than I'd ever heard it. Our mother deserves answers. Our father drugged her for 3 decades and you and your father helped him do it. You can tell us now, or we can get lawyers and subpoenas and make this a lot more complicated for everyone involved. David's face went pale. He looked at me pleadingly. I didn't know, he said. I swear I didn't know the full story until after my father died and I found his records. By then you'd been taking the pills for so long I didn't know what to do. Tell us what you found, I said quietly. Please, David. I need to know what I've been putting into my body all these years. David looked around the empty pharmacy, then sighed heavily. He went to his office in the back and came out with a file folder. He laid it on the counter between us and opened it. My father kept detailed records of what he called special arrangements, David said quietly. The Somnitol prescription wasn't for sleeping pills. It was a combination of a mild sedative and a low-dose antipsychotic. Nothing dangerous in the amounts prescribed, but enough to cause emotional blunting, reduced motivation, some memory issues. The kind of thing that would keep someone compliant and passive without making them obviously impaired. I felt Sarah's hand grip mine. Michael's jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Why, I whispered. Why would Dr. Patterson prescribe something like that? According to my father's notes, David said, not meeting my eyes, Gerald came to Dr. Patterson claiming you were having paranoid episodes, accusing him of infidelity, threatening to leave him and take the children. He said you needed to be calmed down before you destroyed the family. Dr. Patterson apparently agreed to help, but he said it had to be done carefully so you wouldn't know what you were really taking. It was all lies, I said, my voice shaking. I never had paranoid episodes. I never threatened anyone. Gerald made it all up to justify drugging me because he was actually having an affair and didn't want me to figure it out. David nodded miserably. I know that now. But my father believed Gerald. Dr. Patterson believed Gerald. They thought they were helping stabilize a difficult situation. They thought they were protecting your family. They were helping my father abuse our mother, Sarah said, her voice cold and sharp. They were accomplices to 30 years of systematic drugging and financial exploitation. I hope you understand the seriousness of what you're telling us. I do, David said quietly. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Patterson. When I found these records after my father died, I should have come to you. I should have told you the truth. But I was scared of the liability, scared of what it would mean for the pharmacy. I made the wrong choice. Yes, you did, Michael said. But you're making the right choice now by telling us the truth. We're going to need copies of all of those records. Everything your father kept about this arrangement. David nodded and began making copies. As the machine hummed and spit out pages, I stood there processing what I just learned. For 30 years, I'd been given psychiatric medication under false pretenses. Medication that had altered my personality, suppressed my emotions, made me a passive observer in my own life. And it had all been based on Gerald's lies, enabled by medical professionals who should have protected me, but instead had helped my husband maintain control over me. We left the pharmacy with a folder full of documentation, proof of what had been done to me, evidence that could be used in court. As we walked to the car, Sarah turned to me with tears in her eyes again. Mom, she said, I'm so sorry. All these years I thought you just didn't care as much about things. I thought you were just reserved, just naturally calm. I never knew you were being drugged. I never knew Dad was doing this to you. You couldn't have known, I said, pulling her into a hug. Nobody could have known except the people who were in on it. Your father was very careful to maintain his image as a devoted husband. He fooled everyone. But we're going to make this right, Michael said firmly. We're going to find the best lawyer we can, and we're going to make sure everyone knows what really happened. Dr. Patterson, the pharmacy, Dad's reputation, all of it. They're all going to face consequences. Finding a lawyer proved easier than I expected. Sarah did research and found a firm in the city that specialized in elder abuse and medical malpractice. The attorney's name was Margaret Chun, and when we met with her in her downtown office, she listened to our story with an expression that shifted from professional interest to genuine outrage. She reviewed every document we brought. The false medical records, the bank statements, the photographs of Gerald and Vivian, the pharmacy records showing what I'd actually been prescribed. She asked detailed questions about the timeline, about my mental state over the years, about my father's inheritance, and how it had disappeared into Gerald's hidden accounts. When we finished, Margaret sat back in her chair and looked at me with something like admiration. Mrs. Patterson, she said, what was done to you constitutes several serious crimes. Medical fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, possibly even false imprisonment in a legal sense since you were chemically restrained without proper consent. The fact that medical professionals participated in this makes it even more egregious. Can we get the money back? Michael asked. The inheritance that our grandfather left for Mom? Margaret nodded slowly. We can certainly try. The hidden accounts are in your father's name, which complicates things since he's deceased. But if we can prove the money originated from your inheritance and was fraudulently concealed, we have a strong case for recovery. We'll also pursue claims against Dr. Patterson's estate, and potentially against the pharmacy for their role in dispensing medication under false pretenses. What about Vivian? I asked. The woman Gerald was involved with. Can she be held accountable? That depends, Margaret said. If she knowingly benefited from stolen funds, we might have a case for recovery of assets. The apartment, for instance, was purchased with your money even though it's in your late husband's name. We'll need to investigate what she knew and when she knew it. Over the following weeks, Margaret and her team built our case methodically. They tracked down Vivian, who still lived in the apartment Gerald had bought. They served her with legal papers demanding information about her relationship with Gerald and any financial support he'd provided. They filed complaints with the medical board against Dr. Patterson, even though he was retired and living in Florida. They notified the state pharmacy board about the Miller family's role in the scheme. Vivian hired her own lawyer and claimed she'd known nothing about Gerald being married. She said he'd told her he was divorced, that I was his ex-wife who he still helped financially out of obligation. She said she believed him completely and was devastated to learn the truth. Her lawyer argued she was as much a victim as anyone. But Margaret's investigators found evidence that contradicted Vivian's claims. They found letters she'd written mentioning meeting Gerald's children, asking about his family obligations, references that made it clear she knew he had a wife at home. They found receipts showing she'd accompanied Gerald to Cedar Springs on several occasions, staying at hotels just outside town. She'd known. Maybe she'd chosen to believe his version of events, but she'd known he was married. The legal proceedings moved slowly, grinding through depositions and document requests and motions. But while the lawyers worked, something else was happening. Word was spreading through Cedar Springs about what Gerald had done. At first, I'd worried about the gossip, about becoming the subject of pitying looks and whispered conversations. But what actually happened surprised me. People were angry on my behalf. Women from my book club at the library, neighbors I'd known for decades, members of our church, they all reached out with support and outrage. They'd thought Gerald was such a devoted husband, and learning the truth about his betrayal infuriated them. Mrs. Henderson, the nurse who'd worked for Dr. Patterson, called me in tears. She said she'd had no idea what Dr. Patterson was doing, that he'd never mentioned my case to her, that if she'd known she would have reported it immediately. She offered to testify about Dr. Patterson's character, about times she'd seen him bend rules for patients he considered friends. David Miller from the pharmacy faced consequences too. The state board launched an investigation into his father's practices and David's failure to report what he'd discovered. He might lose his license. Part of me felt sorry for him because he'd been trying to protect his father's legacy, but a larger part of me knew he'd made a choice to stay silent when he should have spoken up. Dr. Patterson himself was harder to reach. He was elderly now, in his 80s, and his lawyer claimed he was suffering from dementia and couldn't adequately defend himself or participate in proceedings. Margaret argued that was convenient timing, but there wasn't much we could do if he was genuinely impaired. Still, the medical board revoked his license retroactively, a symbolic gesture that at least put his misconduct on record. Meanwhile, I was changing. Without the medication, I felt like I was waking up from a decades-long sleep. Emotions that had been dampened for so long came flooding back, sometimes overwhelming in their intensity. I cried more in those first few months than I had in the previous 30 years combined. I cried for the time I'd lost, for the woman I'd been before Gerald stole her away, for my children who'd grown up with a mother who was physically present but emotionally absent. But I also laughed. Real, genuine laughter that came from deep in my belly. I felt joy when I played with my grandchildren, actually felt it instead of going through the motions. I felt anger when it was appropriate to feel angry. I felt the full spectrum of human emotion, and it was simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating. Sarah helped me redecorate the house, removing every trace of Gerald's presence. We painted walls in colors I actually liked instead of the neutral beiges Gerald had always insisted on. We rearranged furniture. We hung new artwork. We made the space mine in a way it had never been before. Michael helped me sort through the financial mess. With Margaret's guidance, we were able to freeze the hidden accounts while the legal proceedings continued. We tracked down every dollar of my father's inheritance, documented where it had gone, built an ironclad case for recovery. 6 months after I poured those pills down the drain, we had our first major victory. The court ruled that the apartment Gerald had bought for Vivian was purchased with fraudulently concealed marital assets and awarded it to me. Vivian had to move out. The property was mine to sell or keep as I chose. I chose to sell it. I didn't want any connection to that place, to that chapter of Gerald's secret life. The sale brought in enough money to significantly boost my financial security. The hidden bank accounts were more complicated. Gerald had moved money around cleverly, invested it in ways that made the paper trail murky. But Margaret's team was thorough. They traced every transaction back to the original inheritance, proved that Gerald had systematically diverted funds that should have been community property. The court ordered the accounts released to me. When I finally saw the balance, I was stunned. With careful investment over 30 years, my father's inheritance had grown substantially. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, enough to help my children and grandchildren, enough to make a real difference. Vivian's case took longer to resolve. She fought hard, claiming she deserved compensation for 25 years of believing she was in a legitimate relationship. But ultimately, the evidence against her was too strong. She'd knowingly been involved with a married man, had accepted gifts and support bought with stolen money. The court ordered her to repay a portion of what Gerald had given her over the years. I knew I'd probably never see most of that money. Vivian didn't have assets the way Gerald had hidden them. But it wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about accountability, about making sure everyone who'd participated in or benefited from Gerald's deception faced consequences. Through it all, I kept getting stronger. My mind grew sharper without the medication clouding it. My body grew healthier as I started taking better care of myself, eating properly, exercising, actually engaging with life instead of drifting through it. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman I recognized, a woman who resembled the person I'd been at 42 before the pills started, but wiser now, harder, more determined. I joined a support group for victims of elder abuse. Hearing other people's stories, sharing my own, it helped me process what had happened. It helped me understand that I wasn't alone, that many people had been manipulated and controlled by those they trusted most. And it felt good to offer support to others, to use my experience to help someone else recognize the signs of abuse before they lost as many years as I had. On what would have been my and Gerald's 50th wedding anniversary, I did something symbolic. I went to the cemetery where Gerald was buried. I hadn't visited his grave since the funeral. Standing there looking at his headstone with its dates and the inscription "Beloved Husband and Father," I felt a complicated mix of emotions. I didn't forgive him. I don't know if I ever will. What he did was too deliberate, too sustained, too cruel. But I also didn't want to carry the weight of hating him anymore. He'd taken enough from me. I wasn't going to give him my present and future as well as my past. I stood there and I spoke to the headstone, knowing he couldn't hear but needing to say the words anyway. "You didn't break me," I said. "You tried but you failed. I survived you. I survived the drugs and the lies and the betrayal. And I'm going to live the rest of my life on my terms, fully present, fully alive, fully myself. You don't get to take anything more from me." Then I walked away and I didn't look back. A year after I stopped taking the pills, Margaret called with news. The medical board had completed its investigation and issued a formal censure of Dr. Patterson's conduct. The pharmacy board had fined the Miller family's business and put them on probation. Every entity that had participated in Gerald's scheme had faced some form of consequence. More importantly, all of the financial assets had been recovered and transferred to accounts in my name only. After legal fees and expenses, I had more money than my father had originally left me, thanks to decades of investment growth that Gerald had ironically managed quite well. I used some of that money to establish a foundation in my father's name. It provides support for victims of elder abuse, helps fund legal representation for those who can't afford it, and educates people about the warning signs of financial exploitation. If my experience could help even one person avoid what I went through, it would be worth it. Sarah and Michael were proud of me. They told me so often. They apologized repeatedly for not seeing what was happening, for not recognizing that their mother wasn't herself. I told them there was nothing to apologize for, that Gerald had been very good at hiding the truth, that even I hadn't fully understood what was being done to me. My grandchildren knew me differently now. Emma, who was 10, told me I seemed happier than she remembered, more fun. She didn't know the grandmother who'd been medicated into passivity. She only knew this version of me, the one who played games with real enthusiasm, who laughed at her jokes, who listened with actual engagement when she talked about her day. I was 73 years old, and in many ways I was just starting to really live. I'd lost 30 years, yes, but I had years ahead of me that would be mine, fully and completely mine. I made plans. Real plans for travel, for hobbies, for experiences I wanted to have. I enrolled in art classes at the community center. I joined a hiking group for seniors. I said yes to invitations instead of automatically declining. The woman I'd been at 42 wouldn't recognize the woman I'd become at 73. But that was okay. I'd been through fire and come out forged into something stronger. Gerald had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a compliant shell that served his purposes. But I was still here, still standing, reclaiming everything he tried to steal. Some nights I still struggled to sleep, but now it was natural, normal insomnia that came from an active mind rather than chemically induced unconsciousness. And I was grateful for it. Grateful for every moment of awareness, even the uncomfortable ones. Because awareness meant I was alive, truly alive, for the first time in decades. I thought about the woman who'd sat in Dr. Patterson's office 30 years ago, believing what her husband and her doctor told her, trusting that the pills would help, never suspecting the truth. I wished I could go back and warn her, tell her to question everything, to trust her instincts, to demand real answers. But I couldn't change the past. What I could do was make sure my story was told, make sure other people knew what to watch for, how easily trust could be weaponized against you. I gave interviews to local news outlets. I spoke at community events. I shared my experience anywhere someone was willing to listen. And people did listen. My story resonated with more people than I'd expected. Other women came forward with their own experiences of being medicated or controlled or manipulated by partners who were supposed to love them. The conversation grew larger than just my case, became part of a broader discussion about autonomy and trust and the ways vulnerable people can be exploited by those closest to them. Gerald had tried to make me small, silent, manageable. Instead, his betrayal had given me a voice and a purpose. The irony wasn't lost on me. Standing in my kitchen now, the kitchen I'd reclaimed and repainted and made mine, I sometimes thought about those little blue pills. For 30 years they'd controlled my life, stolen my time, dulled everything that made me who I was. But I'd survived them. I'd survived Gerald. I'd survived all of it. And now finally I was free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.